Okay, well, Heather Falconer, who was the organizer and our captain, had a power outage problem and bad storms where she is, so she can't join us today. So we're going to all sort of collaborate our way through this session, and we'll start with some introductions, and then we have a series of questions that we've developed, and we'll show you what those are, and then we'll take turns responding to them. Of course, open it up for Q&A, and if questions come up, you can raise your hand or put them in the chat box, and we'll try to make do as best we can. Okay, so I will go ahead and start. My name is David Blakesley. I'm a professor at Clemson University in South Carolina. That's my day job. My night job is as a publisher of Parlor Press, which is a scholarly publishing company. We're going to be having our 20-year anniversary next year. So we've been around for a while. We've published over 300 books now, each one of them in 4 or 5 different versions, you know, hardcover and EPUB and PDF and all of that. We publish 16 book series and do the production for a lot of journals in the field now also. So with that, I will pass it to one of my colleagues. Who would like to go next to introduce yourself?
I'll go next. I'm Amy McClure. I am the writing specialist at Clark University in Dubuque, Iowa. And what does writing specialist mean? I'm still shaping the job. I run the University Writing Center. I also do professional and faculty development in the teaching of writing, so I deliver a lot of workshops. I'm also involved in a lot of institutional committees like DEI. I'm a staff member. I don't have faculty status any longer, so as a staff member, I'm also involved in a lot of other kind of institutional conversations as well. So I wear a lot of different hats at Clark, and I am also the A series editor on the Practices and Possibilities series for the WAC Clearinghouse. And I've been working with Practices and Possibilities since 2019. I started as an associate editor, but I've also worked in the past for Computers and Composition. I've done manuscript reviews for Feminist Teacher, and I've been in sort of involved in the publication processes at lots of institutions that I've attended. So literary and art magazines at my undergraduate institution, and then beyond that. So yeah, I'm here as sort of a new face, I feel. I am really happy to be part of the WAC Clearinghouse and Practices and Possibilities. I think, as I get to talk about it today, is an exciting publication to be part of. So I'm really thankful to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Who would like to go next?
I can go next.
Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel LeVay, and I'm the acquisitions editor at Utah State University Press. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm talking to you all today from Pocatello, Idaho, where I live and work on the occupied lands of the Shoshone-Bannock peoples. And I'm really happy to be here talking with you all today about the publishing processes, what to expect, and how to navigate it, because these conversations are really the best part of my job, and I very much look forward to them. So I do hope that if you have questions for me, you'll throw those into the chat. I've worked in university press publishing for about 15 years now, with my first 11 years at the University of Washington Press, where I worked primarily in marketing and sales, but also did some acquisitions work. And I've now been at USUP for a little over 4 years. I edit lists in writing studies, folklore, natural history, and environmental justice. We also have 2 series specifically in writing studies, the Computers and Composition Digital Press, which is an open access and multimodal online series edited by the CCDP editorial board, and Current Arguments in Composition, which internally we call tiny books because they're longer than an article and much shorter than a monograph. But beyond that, the vast majority of the books that I acquire in writing studies simply fall under the USUP in print.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Who's up next?
I can go next.
All right.
I'm Michael Pemberton. I'm a professor of writing and linguistics at Georgia Southern University, and I also direct the Writing Center there. I sort of began my editing career, well, not completely began, but an early part of my editing career was in co-founding one of the first WAC journals in the country, which is called at the time Language and Learning Across the Disciplines. This was in 1994. And I've been an editor of that journal, the primary editor for the last 15 years, but about 20, 25 years overall. I just stepped away from that a couple of years ago. But one of the things that I did near the end of my tenure as editor of the journal was to create a book series, which is called Across the Disciplines Books. And it was a series that was created in response to a specific exigency, which was, it was part of the pattern of our publication history to publish a couple of themed issues each year. And one of the things we discovered was that a number of these themed issues, once we set out the call for proposals, would receive something like 25, 35, 45 different proposals, many of which looked excellent and superb, but not all of which could be published in a single issue of a scholarly journal. So the book series was originally founded as a way to provide a larger and richer venue for some of these themed issues to be developed into fuller edited collections. And to date, I think we've published about 5 or 6 different volumes. We have another couple of them in the pipeline. So it's not a publication, a book series that has published a huge number of volumes, certainly nothing approaching what Parlor Press has been able to do. But we are also expanding our mission in some ways so that we're looking for scholarly monographs that do not necessarily come from an affiliation with the journal, but which are worthy of publication in their own right. And if we get to it a little bit later in the session, I can talk a bit more about the mission of the book series and how it sort of fits in with other publications in WAC.
Thank you, Michael. That's actually one of our first topics, so get ready. All righty.
I'll go next.
Hi, Joan.
Hi, I'm Joan Mullen. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, recently an emerita, but took a first-year writing program there into a department, so was the founding chair of a new department of writing, rhetoric, and digital studies. That's the background that I bring to this, as well as having been one of the early people involved in the WAC Clearinghouse, in the WAC movements in the last 25, 30 years, and really being privileged to work with a lot of people on this committee in doing so. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I began doing a lot of more international work, and that's been the bulk of what I've done in the last 21 years, in addition to the department creation. That's of interest to me because the minute I started working with people in London, I realized we weren't speaking the same language, didn't have the same research traditions, and that their work was making me question and think differently about how I thought about writing and students, my position as a faculty member, in particular as a writing program director. And as I began to interact with other people across Europe and Asia and Latin America and Africa, all these countries that were really not accessible to me because I wasn't looking for them, but the work wasn't accessible even online. Searches didn't bring it up. I, along with Terry Zawacki, Magnus Gustafson, my co-editors here, we're lucky enough to talk to Mike, who encouraged us to start a book series, which is what the International Exchanges is all about. It's about the studies of writing worldwide. And it really opens us up as scholars to challenges that, in particular in English medium countries, those in particular influenced by the US composition ways of thinking about writing. It opens us up and challenges us to a range of ideas that we need to pay attention to if we're preparing students to work globally.
Okay, thank you, Joan. I'm going to show some slides behind my head, and those are just meant to help us keep track of discussion points and topics. And our first, this is an outline of the topics that we generated on our own, and we'll get into more specifics as we go. But issues related to scholarly mission, mission of a series or a press or even a journal, and how those figure into the whole process. The publishing process generally, people aren't always aware of how that maps out over time. The decision-making process, that's one of the big mysteries, of course, and that varies quite a lot across different contexts and so on. The process of moving from a dissertation to a book, an issue always of concern for emerging scholars, and probably a little more complicated than most realize. We have a section on when we'll offer some advice for new authors, a section on open access with 3 S's. Because open access publishing is so important to the field, and certainly, as the WAC Clearinghouse has demonstrated, is invaluable to our profession. And any particular issues that open access publishing, from the perspective of an author especially, might raise. And then emerging trends in writing across curriculum and writing in the disciplines with regard to publishing, such as Joan just mentioned, the internationalizing, globalization of the field is impacting publications that we've begun to see. So with that, let's move to the first one on our agenda, which has to do with mission. You'll see the questions up there. I'm not going to read every single question because I don't want to be talking the whole time, but what I'm going to do now is invite any of our panelists to pick a question and respond to it. And then we can get the Q&A going, and others can jump in as we go. Maybe while it's fresh in your mind, Michael, you could tackle the mission question.
Sure, I can jump in here. Because I think that the 2 questions that I want to address is the first one, which is how does it identify and define the scholarly mission, but also to touch a little bit on the last question, which is should this mission change over time? And I alluded to my response to both of those questions in my previous discussion. The Across the Disciplines book series, as I said before, began its life as a way to expand and develop some of the themes that were not possible to expand as richly and fully as we might like in the single issue of an academic journal. What this has also meant, the mission of the book series aligns very closely with the mission of the Across the Disciplines journal, which is to publish scholarship that focuses specifically on interdisciplinary issues in the field, having to do with language, communication, written communication especially, but also touching on some levels of pedagogy. What makes this particular series not unique by any stretch of the imagination, but I guess one of its particular focuses is that we look at the field of interdisciplinary communication from both a theoretical as well as a pedagogical perspective. One of the reasons why we sometimes ended up rejecting articles for the journal across the disciplines was because they took an entirely pedagogical, classroom-oriented kind of approach. This is what we do in my classroom in order to talk about disciplinary issues, but did not really try to discuss or develop those ideas in relation to a theory or theories. One of the benefits of this particular book series is that it's one in which it publishes reprints a few of the articles that appeared in the original themed issue, but asks the editors to develop the edited collection in ways that emphasize a broad cross-section of different disciplines that can bring their voices to this discussion, and to also make sure that pedagogical issues are addressed, but certainly from a theoretical perspective. And I'll just point to one of a couple of the publications, book publications that we've had in recent years. Our first one was the book Performing Anti-Racist Pedagogy and Rhetoric, Writing and Communication, guest edited by Frankie Condon and Vershawn Ashanti Young. So that was a volume that obviously had a very strong pedagogical focus, but it was also one in which they invited a number of scholars from different disciplinary areas to contribute their thoughts, their perspectives on this issue. I'll jump ahead to the last question because I don't want to take too much time. I know that my colleagues have many other more interesting things to say. But the last question is, should the mission change over time? And I think that in our case, it probably will, largely because the original mission of providing an opportunity for an expanded version of themed journal issues is great, and we want to continue that. But I think that there are also a lot of other independent collections, scholarly monographs, and issues that are related to our overall mission of interdisciplinary communication and theory that deserve publication. And we're going to be trying to expand possible contributors' knowledge of the fact that this is something that we are very amenable to. It's not just taking issues of the journal and then repackaging them and expanding them for our book series.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. You know, I can tag really easily onto where you just went. And you reminded me of so many things that all of our series and journal publications are trying to do. It's a great setup for us all. As I mentioned, the international series really is looking to think about how our 21st century contexts are informed by globalization, national and transnational identity, social media and social networking, and increased cross-cultural communication and collaboration. Mike's series is looking at that writing across the curriculum niche. What's interesting is how writing is developed around the world outside of the US, where writing is almost always across the disciplines to begin with, and they're almost looking down into, well, what does discrete writing look like? So it's an interesting pairing. So the series really strives to interrogate how both the local and the international inform writing research, and how that impacts writing development no matter where you're situated. So while we have in our collection right now, there's an English across the curriculum from a Hong Kong conference, and they're talking about developing English in particular courses in ways. It's really a research-rich volume. It gives a lot of different ideas about how we might, in our own contexts, explore writing and how students are doing writing and faculty are teaching writing. So in terms of research and methodology, these are really rich places. But again, it also helps us think about how writing is even being done elsewhere. We have a collection coming out on graduate student education and thinking differently about that, and how people across different countries are thinking about the dissertation and writing and supporting graduate students. I'll let you go to that website and look at some of the other things there. But I think, like Mike, I want to think about skipping to that last question about the future. Since we know that all writing research and studies are represented through our language practices, The language of publication is often a political and identity decision. And so, it's this tricky thing we're trying to manage of being published in English, but also opening up to other languages. And we've been really fortunate to have Federico Navarro as a co-editor of our Latin American series, but also as a real partner in the whole book series itself. And that Latin American series invites proposals in Spanish and Portuguese also. We hope that in the future we might use this as a model for developing series in other areas of the world where we might really focus on these research, these books that we don't otherwise have access to or think about. And Federico has made a lot of these into translations or translatable formats. He's been publishing with his co-editors a series of books that are central to the development of these writing traditions in Latin America. If anybody's been to the RAB conferences, you know how important that area is. And they're now accessible to us. He is creating, the series is creating new books also, one of which is about to be published from their, what I would say, conference that is comparable to our 4Cs. We would hope that we would develop more of these kinds of language-specific areas in the future to bring people into a wider discussion and interchange, and to make accessible in more languages than just whatever the primary language is, the research that we're missing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joan.
I can go next. At Utah State University Press, our scholarly mission is pretty simple. It's to produce high quality books for scholarship and classroom use. And I think that that sounds fairly vague, and in part that's intentional because we want to leave ourselves room to grow and to shift along with the disciplines in which we work, which ties into that last question. Yes, definitely, things will shift over time for us. We really view publishing in our books as being part of a much larger conversation within the disciplines and beyond. And we want to be forward-looking in terms of how we advance those conversations. Thinking a little bit about how that mission translates into how submissions are evaluated, I can say that we don't spend very much time kind of considering market or like unit saleability of particular titles. We know that the vast majority of our monographs and edited collections are going to sell 150 to 200 copies. And we're comfortable with knowing that some will come in a little under and some will come a little bit over. So the primary question and concern for us is, what value does this add to the field? One place where market does bear a significant impact on what we publish and how we publish it is in thinking about price points. Price point is really key for us. We want to ensure that our books are accessible for contingent faculty, graduate students, and course use. So the vast majority of USUP books are at or under $30. And there's some dependence there. If a book is huge, like 150,000 words, it's going to cost a little bit more, but for the most part, they're at or under that price threshold, because it's really important for us to make sure that the books are reaching the audiences that they need. Kind of going a little bit further into how submissions are evaluated, I am the primary evaluator of proposals. We don't send our proposals out for review, and instead I invite in full manuscript review that feel promising and are a good fit for our lists, and then evaluate the work on the larger term. Most of the time, if I say no, it typically has to do with a question of fit and whether or not we are kind of a primary publisher in that subdisciplinary area, or if there's just too much overlap with other titles that I have in the pipeline. Because we are a small publisher and I produce about 25 books a year, I have to make sure that I'm kind of covering all of the different bases and subdisciplinary areas that are of keen importance to us. USUP has a long history of publishing in this field, and we're well known for works in WAC, WID, writing centers, WPA Life and WPA Work, and questions of disciplinarity in the field at large. But I'm also actively working to expand our lists in two-year colleges. I'm a two-year college grad, and I feel strongly that this is a really key part of our discipline and the conversations that we're having both here in writing studies, higher ed, and also society writ larger. I'm also looking for more works in TechCom and opening up scholarship on language and identity. Those are key places where we're really investing in terms of our mission and putting support and mentorship into those areas.
Thank you, Rachel. Amy, you want to take a shot at it?
Sure, yeah, I wasn't sure how much time we wanted to, if we wanted to move forward. I will talk a little bit about Practices of Possibilities mission. It's what attracted me to join the editorial staff there. So the mission is to address the full range of practices in the field of writing studies, including instructional practices, research methodologies, and professional practices. It's exactly what it says, practices and possibilities. And whenever we think about how that should or could change over time, I think the mission is to change according to the readers and the downloaders and the practitioners who use these texts. And I was one of them before I arrived. One of the very first books that I ever really came into contact with was The Informed Writer, which we in Practices and Possibilities have a reprint of that book made digitally. So I thought it was very serendipitous of me to join that particular editorial board because of that sort of openness. And the WAC Clearinghouse obviously is open access. So one of the beautiful things Mike Palmquist said sort of at the very beginning was, nobody makes any money. And I love that. Nobody makes any money. Any money that is made from publication goes directly back into the clearinghouse. So no, I don't think that should change because I think education should be open access and these materials should be open access or available at a low cost. But I don't want to spend too much time on mission because we have a lot of other wonderful questions. So I'll let you take it back over, David.
I'll just say a couple of words. Rachel's overview of USUP sounds very familiar to me because in many ways, Parlor Press does very similar things. Of course, we're not affiliated with the university, so we're an independent scholarly press, which means that some things operate a little bit differently. But on the whole, what she said is a great description of how I think smaller publishers in RetComp tend to work. When we review submissions, typically our series editors are the front line. I have to rely on them quite heavily because I'm busy shipping out books and doing all that stuff. And so the series editors review manuscripts, and then we discuss them together, and then we decide whether a manuscript submission is ready for outside review, or if it needs more development first, or whether it's not a good fit. It turns out, I think, Rachel, you mentioned this also, that the question of fit is the one that pops up a lot, particularly with regard to rejections. And the one piece of advice I would give authors is to really carefully look at things like mission, but also the books that have been published by in a particular series or from a particular press in the past. In many ways, those are what define the mission or are expressions of the mission. And quite often we receive submissions that aren't even close to matching up, and in fact kind of reveal themselves or reveal that the authors haven't even looked at what we publish at all, zero. And those are easy ones to reject. Of course, we do it nicely, and with helpful feedback usually, or we try to give helpful feedback. But look at what a publisher, and you do this with a journal also. What have they published lately? And does my interest line up with that? And the answer should usually be fairly clear, and then you know whether you want to take a chance on it. Okay, let's go to a new slide here. The publication process. That varies quite a bit across organizations and types of publishers. Sometimes traditional publishers these days take anywhere from 6 months to many, many years, depending upon certain economic situations and factors, and how many books might be in the pipeline in a particular area, that sort of thing. Anybody want to tackle one of those questions?
I'd be interested in tackling the mentoring one, and I'd love to hear this from others on this panel, because we're really curious about how to do this and how we do it. We're pretty committed to the mentoring publication process in that we invite proposals and we get them all the time, but we're also going to conferences and listening to people talk about what they're doing, and then following what David just said about looking at publications and what people have done. But there's people with dissertations, of course, who haven't published a lot yet. And I found that such a daunting process when I was just out of graduate school. And we have developed just a way of working with authors to encourage them to think about it, to do exactly what David said. We have a form that they follow with questions to think about. We actually work at the proposal stage with people, securing commitments with them along the way, but also just working with them to develop what they have. So there's a lot of feedback in addition to using our review board, which is people from all over the country. And we try to find people whose areas of expertise match. And sometimes their local cultures match, because that's important if someone is coming out of a tradition I don't understand and maybe using questions that I actually don't read correctly. So how to think about framing those is useful with mentoring, but I'd be curious to know how others work within this mentoring author-editor kind of relationship.
Joan, I think we at Practices and Possibilities have a very similar process. We do get submissions. We have a submission portal. So if any of you listening, it's submissions.coloradostate.edu. Feel free to go there and check it out, free to create a username and password for yourself. But yeah, we have our editorial board. We learn their backgrounds and expertise and what they would be interested in. When we get those sort of unannounced submissions, but we do, like you said, we're at conferences or symposiums or just talks where we're talking to authors. And a lot of times, if I'm super intrigued by something and I think, wow, this would be a great fit for Practices and Possibilities, I say, hey, are you thinking about this as a book project? And usually that and it really sparks a lot of really great informative discussion after that. So very similar, I think, to what you all do. Yeah.
There's also a question about how to take dissertations to the book process, if we have time to go there.
Yeah, we've got a slide coming up, and we'll get there definitely. I put in the chat box a link to a Rhetoric Society of America webinar that we held last year, I think in October. And there are speakers from multiple presses, and we interact with the audience and present strategies for taking a dissertation to a book and and what editors might look for and so on. And we definitely want to get there at some point. I do want to mention also that in the agenda section for today's panel, there's a handout that I prepared on the review and development process that we use at Parlor Press, but that's actually going to be fairly common. There are 20 questions that I could think of that I consider when I look at a proposal or prospectus. Anywhere from, have the authors looked at our submission guidelines and followed them or not, all the way down to, was it a dissertation and how long ago was the dissertation published, that sort of thing. I've had people submit proposals for turning their dissertation into a book, but the dissertation wasn't even done yet, and they wanted to publish it as a book simultaneously. I said, well, you need to wait just a little bit. But I just wanted to mention, to follow up on what Joan and Amy have discussed with regard to mentoring. One of the things I've learned over time is that the book publishing process is really a collaborative mentoring relationship, and kind of goes both ways, in that authors, of course, are trying to teach editors what they're trying to do with their book, and editors do a lot of teaching as editors and as publishers about how or things that you need to think about with regard to audience, and even things like the shelf life of your publication. You want it to be a long shelf life, especially if it's a book. So how do you think about your topic, or how will you think about it 10 years from now? And maybe that's the audience that you're writing to. Things like that. So there's a lot of mutual back and forth teaching going on. And that's, for me, the most valuable part of the process as a publisher, is that kind of interaction. We have a big poetry series, and man, I learned so much from the poets, but they learned from me too. All kinds of different things. It's really fun. So be ready for that as an author, and be willing to and eager to collaborate and be mentored, and that kind of back and forth. Are we ready to move on, or? Yeah, okay.
I was going to share a little bit about the publication processes and what to expect from that,
Sure.
Just to kind of give a very nuts and bolts overview of timing and expectations, because I think that transparency is really important. And just to also give an FYI, I am in the process of detailing all of the systems that I'm going to talk about in a written document that will adhere to the recently circulated anti-racist heuristics developed by a wonderful team of scholars in TechCom. So shortly, most of this information will be available on our website as well. But just to kind of give a quick dive into what to expect, because this timeline is fairly typical for most university process. We ask for proposals on projects up front, and then at that point, I decide whether or not to bring in the full manuscript for review. If we do bring the manuscript in for review, that review process used to take 4 to 6 weeks, but right now is looking at more like 8 to 12 weeks. And I think that's going to become a new norm going forward. We can all relate to challenging times and circumstances at this point. So I think 8 to 12 is going to be kind of a new norm for book length manuscripts. I do ask our authors to feel free and suggest names of appropriate scholars that I could query for peer review, but much more importantly, I also ask for names of seemingly appropriate reviewers that I should not query. We all know that there are folks in every discipline who should not necessarily be trusted with our work. And if that's the case for you, I will honor and respect that. I can't guarantee that I'll ask those you've recommended, but I can promise not to query those that you don't want to see your work at this stage. To give a little more information about that, our review process is single anonymous, meaning reviewers see the author editors, but not vice versa. Coming out of that process, I rarely see publish and I rarely see reject. Most projects occupy more of a middle space that can run the gamut between publish with minor revisions or revise and resubmit. And many projects do require additional rounds of peer review. And for that, we typically try to return to the original reviewers if possible, but of course, it's not always possible to do so because of scheduling. But either way, it will be transparent to the authors and editors that I work with as to whether or not original reviewers are able to look at additional rounds of the manuscript. And then once we have the approval of 2 peer reviewers, we move on to our faculty editorial committee for approval. And that's a pretty quick process. It usually takes about 2 weeks. And under most circumstances, we contract projects at that stage, post peer review, once all of the contingencies are met. We're not doing as many advanced contracts these days as we have in the past, particularly because there are so many contingencies in those advanced contracts that getting through that process typically results in a much clearer and more straightforward path. And then once the project is approved and contracted, we invite in the full manuscript for peer review. I like to let folks know that about the fastest a book can move from submission of peer reviewable manuscript to finished book in hand is 18 months. So university press publishing is not the fastest. That's not what we're known for. We tend to think that we do a good job with the books, but not necessarily on a super quick timeline. But there's a lot of variability in that 18-month window. So it will depend on the extent of the revisions needed, whether or not it requires multiple rounds of peer review, and the ability of the author editor to dig into those reviews. But importantly, when we talk about timeline, I really like to emphasize that it matters to me that the book is done well and in a way that feels collaborative and generative, not that the book is done quickly. So I just want folks to know that if you work with us, it's not a hard timeline or I need this book back in 4 weeks or we're not interested anymore. We understand that everyone's working in different circumstances and that there's a lot of variability in terms of institutional support or caretaking responsibilities. And we kind of respect and honor all of those components and look to make the book good with you. So the mentorship really comes in at each stage, at the proposal stage, while working through the peer review processes and in preparing the final manuscript. We really view it as collaborative and generative.
Thank you, Rachel. We've been discussing the process and decision-making process a little bit already. So why don't we've mentioned this a couple of times, moving from a dissertation to a book. What do emerging scholars need to know about that? Who would like to tackle that one first?
I can jump in just to get us started, because in some ways it's analogous to issues that our book series has to deal with when people are moving from a special themed issue of a journal into a full edited collection. And it has to do with an understanding of what it means to change the genre in a rather dramatic way. Oftentimes, some of the authors or guest editors who have put together the themed issue may have the misperception that moving to an edited collection is going to be easy and simple and a quick transition. Bring in some previously published articles, slap in a few new ones that we've put together, and suddenly we have a new edited collection. But the requirements are really very different, just like they're very different for going from a dissertation to a full-fledged book. There are matters that have to do with purpose, that have to do with audience, that have to do with a certain kind of internal coherence that you don't necessarily have to have in a themed issue, but you definitely have to have in a full edited collection. So in terms of changing genres from a dissertation to a book, I think one of the things I would counsel people to think about very carefully is dissertations have very different purposes and very different audiences than a full book coming out of a university press or elsewhere might have. In dissertations, one of the things that graduate students are expected to do is in some ways put on a display for people in the profession and their advisors. And part of that display shows up in things like the literature review, where they're expected to demonstrate an extensive and full competence in the entire history and literature that may feed into the topic they're writing about. And oftentimes this may entail referring to people and publications and studies that are 40 or 50 years old that are already very familiar to people in the field. And if they were included in a book publication, they would be a red flag that this is somebody who may not be necessarily very aware of their audience and what they already know. Excuse me. So that awareness of audience is certainly one issue that's important. And then the other one has to do with purpose. Because in many dissertations, in addition to the lit review, it's focusing sometimes on a fairly narrowly defined kind of study, because the goal of the dissertation is to show that you have crafted and carved out a particular niche in that field, and you're going to demonstrate your own individual and original contribution to the field by discussing what is sometimes a rather myopically defined category or study or piece of research. But in a full book, that research has to be imbued throughout the content of the entire volume, and that it has to be presented in a way that not only demonstrates that you are a full-fledged member of the field and everything that that entails, but that you're making an argument that the contribution of your research, of your scholarship, of your awareness of theory as it applies to your research is making a contribution that's substantive enough to really sustain an entire book, rather than just being a relatively small study that's, as some of my students refer to, get the air pump in it and then start pumping it up so that it looks like it's more substantial when it's really not. And this is one of the ways I think that really good book series editors can be useful as mentors, is in helping people to understand exactly what that distinction is and helping them to make the transition between the very narrowly defined and very different genre of a dissertation and turning it into something that is going to be a richer and fuller and substantive contribution to the field in a book.
Wow, Mike, I'm so glad that this is being recorded, because I think we could cut out that piece and put it on the WAC Go page. I think you really just summarized exactly what the research issue often is in dissertations as opposed to that larger genre or the different genre. And hearing you all talk, Amy, Rachel, David, and Mike, you're making me realize that our role for dissertation writers or any writers is really to take what you all are doing for me, and that is something that's tacit, you do automatically, and putting language around it. And I think that that's a process that newer writers to the field don't do as well as a writer, people who have written for a long time, that has to do with audience and genre. And that is, they're not often aware of their assumptions that they're building into a proposal, for example, or a manuscript. What isn't there is often really important, instead of having, as Mike said, all of this literature that doesn't need to be there. So it's finding that balance with an author, I think, that's equally important. Thank you all.
Yeah, I think
thank you,
Michael,
Joan. Go ahead, Rachel.
I think Michael did such a terrific job. And I just say that for me, when I'm looking through a proposal, what I'm looking for is the argument. And I can oftentimes tell when a dissertation has not been fully enough revised, because that sort of meaty part of the proposal is hedged a little. You oftentimes kind of see it come through as, I explore, or this book's asked the question. And really what we want to see a book do is answer a question and put a question forward, and chapter by chapter build those pieces into a larger cohesive argument. So I think that that's really the goal of what a book should do. And I also want to reiterate that nobody revises their book right the first time. Like, I mean, I think that there's oftentimes a misconception amongst particularly folks still in the PhD program that like, oh, some people are nailing it, but they're not. Like, everybody's dissertation needs a little more revision to get there. And so it's really common to see a peer review process and editorial conversations that are nudging that manuscript farther forward, and it gets there. So don't think that because you haven't kind of sufficiently made those revisions that there's going to be kind of a roadblock for you. I mean, it will continue to be a challenge, but like, you'll surmount it. You'll get there. It'll be fine. I promise.
Thank you. I thought I would share a couple of kind of surprising observations that came out of that RSA panel I mentioned on moving from a dissertation to a book. Came from some of my colleagues who are acquisitions editors at, I think, Penn State and Alabama. One of the pieces of advice was to not use your best title on your dissertation. Save your best title for the book. If you use it on your dissertation, it's not going to be helpful for the book. Editors are going to look and see if it's the same title, and that diminishes the value somewhat of the book. And I hadn't even thought of that myself, but it's a good point. So don't use your best title on your dissertation. Save that one for the book. Be very, very careful about publishing more than one chapter of your dissertation as an article. If you publish two, you may not be able to use both those in the book if you develop a book later. So those were two things that I just wanted to toss out there to just keep in mind. And you kind of have to think of those as you're writing your dissertation, thinking way ahead to what the book might actually become. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? I think there was a Sue asked in the chat box about how old is too old in terms of adapting a dissertation for publication. That's a good question. I think you have plenty of time. 10 years is not too much time, I don't think. Depends on how much has changed, how much has been revised. But an important consideration for me is, what have you been doing in the meantime? You can't expect to be doing nothing and then all of a sudden 10 years later convert that dissertation into a book and expect it to be received the same way. A lot of editors will say, we'll look at what you've been publishing, whether you've been active in the field in other ways during that intermediate time.
And I think for me, that's not always a huge consideration, because I think that lots of folks are engaging in non-research publication ways. So I think a bigger question for me is, like, what was that dissertation doing? Like, is your data still sound? Because if you're working with a data pool that was 10 years old, you may not have been thinking about questions of representation or demographics that are going to be key to publication now. So I think that's a place where perhaps if something's more than a few years old, it's going to need kind of an overhaul in terms of finding new data pools to work from. But if you're looking at something a little more qualitative, it may still be thoroughly viable, even after a pretty big chunk of time has passed.
And to build on what Rachel just said, it may be viable in terms of a comparison. So you may take what you did then and then take a look at today's populations and say, look what's moved, look what's changed. And of course, updating that literature within that time frame too.
You're muted, David.
Article versus a book. We don't need to focus on that one much. That was one I threw in there, unless anybody has any questions. Advice for new authors. We've been throwing out a lot of advice for you already. So why don't we jump to open access, because I think there are some very interesting questions and issues that come out of that.
David, can I just respond real quickly to the advice
Sure.
for new authors? Just a quick comment. Please don't be afraid of us. Don't fear running ideas by us or sending us proposals or things that you're thinking about doing. We're kind of a congenial and supportive and friendly group of people overall. I mean, except for David, of course, but I think that all of us would agree that it's really important to each and every one of us that we want to encourage and see more new voices in the field, and we want to see what you're doing, and we want to be as supportive as we possibly can about that. So don't let apprehension or the sense that, oh, my manuscript's not perfect, so I don't feel comfortable sharing my ideas or what I've got with these publishers. I would really dissuade you from thinking in those ways.
Yeah, I would agree, Michael. People tend to wait too long to approach us and to pitch ideas and that sort of thing. Go ahead, Rachel. Sorry.
No, not at all. Sorry. And I was just going to say another little piece of advice is to start to build a few colleagues who can serve as readers for you before you send us a manuscript. And I'd really recommend that you kind of look beyond your grad school cohort and your dissertation team, because those folks have known you and your research a long time, and they might kind of see your work progressing, but not see the ways that it can still progress. And so having kind of a trusted group of readers who can read your work before you send it to us is really significant, and is going to help you get a little further along in the process right off the bat.
One of my buddies, Jack Seltzer, whom many of you know, recommended even coming up with a little bit of money, if you can, from maybe your institution or even out of your own pocket, because it would be well spent, to actually pay someone to read a manuscript for you, someone you don't know, but who's well regarded in the field, or who knows about the field, who can give you an unvarnished reading of your manuscript before you submit it to a press. I thought that's a pretty interesting idea. And there are actually services that will function as a middle ground for you, where they will find the reviewer and you don't even do that. And they just find it for you and handle the exchange of documents and that sort of thing. Okay, open access. Open access publishing.
Yay!
Mike and I have been collaborating with open access publications for quite a long time, and managed to publish at least 50 books open access. And of course, the Clearinghouse is still doing that, and Parlor Press is still doing some of that, both collaboratively and independently. And it's a little bit of a risky proposition for a commercial press or a university press to invest a lot in that, because it does cost money and it takes a lot of time. But the value of open access books and journals and that sort of thing is really high. So
I was going to say, if you're in a position to be an advocate on your campus about having open access publications count, please do so. In reviews I've done around the country in my own institutions, I've seen amazing progress over the last few years in counting towards tenure and promotion, merit, hiring, online publications in ways that didn't count before, especially with all the rigorous review processes now established. And sometimes you have to educate people about those review processes when you put together a portfolio. So think about that and being part of that education system and find out. I mean, that's part of the things you have to find out in your own institution is how does online open access materials count? But I use them all the time in my classes, undergraduate and graduates. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to talk to people about it. I'd be interested in the language policies that inform open access publication, because language policies means a lot of things. I mean, ours is kind of clear for us, but that might be something we can explore too.
I would also say that sort of looking down the road, one of the things that people might keep in mind about open access is that it's relatively easy to get metrics for the number of times that your publication has been accessed and downloaded. And if you can demonstrate at the point that you're coming up for tenure that one of your publications has been accessed by 150,000 different people in different locations, that says a lot. And in some ways, it's easier to provide that kind of information with open access than it is with other kinds of print journals, for example.
And also, along with encouraging institutions to support acceptance of open access for TMP processes, please also try to encourage institutions to financially support the publication of books in open access, because the work we do as editors, the peer review, the copy edit, the metadata, these are all real valuable skills that do have dollars attached to them. And so if institutions cannot and will not support open access, it makes for a much more challenging road for all of us to produce that material.
Michael Todd, our coordinator, tells me we're about out of time. Let me put the last slide up. It has our email addresses on it. This collection of slides you can also find at the session agenda page in PDF format, so you can grab our email addresses there also. I'm sure you can use Google to find any of us pretty easily also. But thank you all for coming today.